Hello, and welcome to PAX Presents the Round Tabletop. Before we begin, we would like to, in the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, as it is their knowledge and experience that holds the key to success of the future generation. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Now, thank you all for joining me. We're here to talk about tabletop games. I'm very excited to do that, but before we kick off, I think a few introductions are in order. I'll be your moderator for this panel. My name's Luke Lancaster. I'm the content manager with PAX Australia. And going round, let's start with Kim on my window.
Sure. It's Kim Breback from Good Games Publishing. I'm the director there.
Ella?
I'm Ella from Ella Loves Board Games. I'm a content creator. I also create content on the Dice Tower. I'm also the marketing and social media coordinator for VR distribution.
Next up, Alex.
I am the president of the TGDA, and I help run Regini Board Games, Regini Games.
And last but not least, Michael.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael O'Brien. I'm the Vice President of Chaosium, which publishes Call of Cthulhu and some other games. And if I get my finger right, I'm going to point to the logo just behind my shoulder. There,
we saw you practicing before we started. We know that's not off the cuff. So as I said, thank you all for joining us. What we'll be doing today is a bit of a roundtable, a State of the Union for the tabletop industry in Australia, some highlights of what's been happening locally, pathways for how the industry grows, how we've had to adapt in an alarmingly different and uncertain year. And I think coming at this from both sides, both what the industry's doing and how people outside the industry can find new games, take part, help support it. So to kick things off, let's talk 2020. What have been some good local releases, some milestones, some developments? When we look back, what's the snapshot of tabletop in 2020 going to look like for you? Yeah, I think
it'll be bad for as a distributor. We've actually had really good sales this year. I would say that there was sales or profits have been like 200%. So in that sense, it's pretty good. A lot of the games that people are playing are actually games that are older because people are just discovering board games. There's a new market that we're reaching out to. So a lot of it is like pandemic, like old games. Catan has been sold out in pandemic. So things like that. I would love to hear what local games have been going well during this time from the publishers.
Well, I'll echo that on.
I was just going to say, is it a surprise that Pandemic was a big seller this year?
It was shocking, actually.
I've been desperately trying to get my hands on Pandemic Legacy Season 1, but I cannot find it anywhere.
Anywhere.
I think Kim was about to jump in on some local games.
Oh, well, I'll just chip in and say as well that we have been hearing the same things through distribution as well. The game sales generally are up, but they're skewing more heavily towards that sort of gateway game thing. And I guess that means there's more people just walking into stores going, help, I'm stuck with the family at home, we're bored, or whoever it is at home, share houses or just couples or whatever. And there's people walking and they're getting recommended probably the staples. So a lot of game sales are there, but I think there's also a bit of skewage away from party games and more towards couples games and family friendly games as well, as people are really finding that they're gaming mainly with people inside their house and much less so outside their house. I think that's reflected in the fact that almost every single games club in Australia is closed at the moment. So all your meetups and all your game groups, and I know we'll talk about those a little bit more later, but they're really not operating at the moment in any state that I know of. Has anyone heard of anything anyway?
No, not in Melbourne. That's true.
It is easy to force your family into playing board games at the moment. Definitely.
Yeah, I think I've heard.
Hasn't worked with me.
There's one physical Blood Bowl tournament in Silverwater this weekend, but apart from that, I know, right? It's slim pickings. If you like Blood Bowl, it's great, but if you don't, not much you can be doing.
Conversely, we've noticed with tabletop RPGs that there's been a explosion of people playing online.
Yeah.
And that's been phenomenal. And I guess in one sense, a tabletop RPG, which is very much theatre of the mind, can actually lend itself quite well to playing on Zoom or Discord or something like that. You have that extra level of difficulty trying to play a board game online compared to, say, a tabletop RPG. So from that sense, it's been quite successful for us.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like, despite us all having to, like, socially distance and really sort of destroying the normal interactions we have with board games, the pandemic has sort of created all these brand new avenues and brand new events and brand new things, ways to do these things. And RPG would obviously be a big one. But I know TGDA has already experimented and talked about doing different things, and everyone's testing and playing board games online as well. It's just showing us all different ways that we can get through this.
Yeah, I think we'll dive into that a little bit more later. Alex, TGDA, just for people who don't know, is Tabletop Game Designers Australia, organisation to support game designers in Australia. Also back to releases. We, funnily enough, it takes about 2 to 3 years. A lot of people don't know this, but it takes about 2 to 3 years from a game design going from kind of a publisher expressing interest in it to it arriving in a gamer's hands on their table. So we've had a long build up into 2020, which was going to be a big year for us, with 4 or 5 new releases. So we have had the 4 or 5 new releases. So we had our first expansion to Unfair land at the beginning of the year. That's the ABDW expansion, which brings in a whole bunch of new theme packs for our sort of modular theme park building game, Unfair. And then we had a couple of small box games that we kind of released in Australia last year, but they've gone global this year. Fluttering Souls, which is a 2-player game, which is very COVID friendly, very light.
Yeah, it got a huge response at was it Essen last year where it debuted?
No, we really debuted it at Gen Con last year. Yeah, and we sold that at Gen Con, and then it did well at PAX Australia as well. I think we sold out of all the stock there as well. It's just kind of like a no-brainer. It's a very cheap, small, light, lovely little game. So you're going to find somebody to be able to play that with. So good timing for us with a kind of COVID-friendly game there. Yes. Then we have another kind of light trick-taking game called Fairy Season, which again for families is probably lucky that we've released that in this year leading up to Christmas. So that's been out for the last couple of months globally as well. And then Guildmaster, our Kickstarter game from a year and a half back, or 2 years ago more like now, has just kind of been launched in Australia and globally last week as well. That one's a bigger game, more of a buddies, play with your buddies kind of game. So that's going to be tougher for people to get to the table.
I have a copy downstairs.
Yeah, exactly. And
we're just longingly looking at it.
That's right. You can play with 2 players, which is good, but it really thrives at 3 and 4 players. So it's
I think
going to be those kind of things.
Something we've all touched on is kind of the current climate has meant that there's been a massive influx of new players to the hobby. Whether it is tabletop RPG or board games or card games or what have you. And it's funny when you mention kind of going back to the old stalwarts of gateway games. Do you think there's going to be kind of a flow-on effect? You talk about 2-year lead times of more kind of entry-level gaming in the hobby.
I certainly do, and we're actually banking on that. We think there'll be a little second bubble of just inside the gateway type games that are going to do well. And we're sort of looking at the schedule of games that we have in the pipeline and playing to that fact as well as the fact that we think it's going to be business as usual under COVID for the next year or so. We're going to need more 2-player games and family-friendly games and cooperative games because pandemic, a lot of people who are new to board gaming or were fairly light gamers before that hadn't tried a co-op game.
Yeah.
They play pandemic and they're like, what?
We don't need to hate each other and argue about
property. We don't need to hate. Yeah. We can do stuff against the game. They're just amazed. There's a lot of consistent feedback from retailers that there's some strong demand for cooperative games coming up as well because people like to work together against common problem in this kind of time, I think.
As a content creator, I've had a lot of those questions like, I've never heard of cooperative games. What can you recommend? Like, because a lot of people, their introduction to board games is Monopoly, where you have to kill each other and beat each other. So, it's a
and that's not the game.
Yeah, yes.
How about you, Alex? Are you seeing any? Sorry, Michael.
Oh, sorry. No, you go on. It's okay.
I was just going to say on that point, from Alex's perspective with TGDA, have you seen anything along that line from local designers? What is the current, I guess, trend or ethos behind a lot of the designs that local board game designers are working toward?
I can say I'm helping out on a couple of projects at the moment, and it just didn't seem sort of the right climate to release a massive board game that you can play 5, 6, 7 players at. To be honest, we actually just released our 2-player game as well, which is called The Damsel's Tale, which you can find on our website. It's just a stunning, beautiful 2-player game in a book box that you can easily play with as a couple, or with someone you live with. It's easy to learn and stuff. But I think one of the most successful projects, which I think we're probably going to bring up later, is for this year was The Ratcatcher, which was a solo game done by Australian designer Matthew Oslin from Platypus Industries, and that did like 143,000 on Kickstarter. Like, if that's not something that shows you that solo games have a massive place at the moment, I don't know what will. But I can say that there hasn't been a huge amount of tabletop games launched on Kickstarter that are Australian this year, unless they've been pretty specifically 2 or 1 player games.
And linked to that, RPGs. I've been doing a lot of solo RPGs. Like, I just discovered them. I didn't know that you could do horror, and a lot of them are diaries. So it's all just prompts. So that was a good discovery for me. And there are a lot of great RPG writers that are Australian. So that was a great discovery this year.
Yeah, I think
we launched some. We launched some 2-player Call of Cthulhu stuff, so that you have 1 keeper and 1 investigator, which is an ideal thing to have people inside inside the house. Ironically, that was originally written by our friends in Poland, our Polish licensees, to launch on Valentine's Day as a couples thing.
How lovely.
It's turned into a pandemic
Couples
thing.
to COVID. Yes.
Yeah, couples. Yeah, exactly.
RPGing inside the bubble.
Yeah. The other thing that we pivoted to very quickly when we realized we're going to have these lockdowns and social isolation and things like that is we got each of our line editors to write a guide to, if you wanted to start playing our games online, this is a great place to start. These are great titles that would lend itself to it. And then we wrote a general introductory guide, this is all on our website, about how you can get into online gaming, whether you want to use Zoom or Discord or one of the virtual tabletops like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or whatever. And
that's a great idea.
We had a great response. Yeah, we had a great response to that. And I think it's been responded to really well by fans, not just here in Australia, but of course all over the world. And I think one of the things that people have discovered playing online is as long as you can match up your time zones, you can play games with people everywhere, which has been a revelation to a lot of people.
Yeah, I should also call out very specifically, I've got the Call of Cthulhu starter set behind me, which is great for that level of progression as well, because the very first scenario is solo, choose your own adventure style, to teach you the rules as a keeper, and then it goes to 2 or 3 players, and it's just a very nice, obviously starter set. And I think having that pathway, that lead in, is so important, especially when you don't have community groups or clubs that you can go to right now to have people who teach you games. So I think that barrier is becoming a lot more obvious and clear-cut between people who can play board games and teach board games and people who can't. And I think the things that are doing really well are the things that can break through that barrier. And I'm seeing a lot of that, especially in gateway games and solo games. It's really, really cool. Something you just touched on, though, Michael, that I'd like to talk about is the idea that there are a lot of online tools. I mean, we're on a video call now. If we wanted to grab some dice, we could play an RPG fairly easily. We don't lose too much in the translation. But when we're looking at translating board games or card games, that's a lot more difficult. There are tools out there, but how have you found people have been responding to either dedicated digital versions of games? I know Asmodee, for instance, do a lot of digital translations of their board games, or things like Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia.
if I can, as a
yeah.
content creator, one of my most engaging posts ever was there was an Australian, I forgot his name, sorry, but he made like a PDF of all the links that of the online games that you can do, and it's been the most shared. So there's a lot of interest in how to do that, and I think that's also a way to get new into board games because that's a way to introduce them to but basically what's out there because people only have a limited idea of what a board game is and they're blown away by all the things that you can play and it's because it's online you don't have to purchase it so it's a lower barrier to entry even yeah so a lot of sorry
No, I was just going to say, just on that point, I find it really interesting teaching people games when there are digital versions of them because you can't do a wrong move because the game physically won't let you, and that's a really interesting kind of
depends on the platform.
difference. Depends on the platform.
Yeah.
Depends on the platform.
Yeah, if it's just flip the table. I think we've all been there with Tabletop Simulator.
Yes.
So, I mean, we've been using Tabletop Simulator and Tabletopia for the past 4 years to develop games and playtest them online. Obviously, I think Tabletopia is a little bit newer than that. But, for example, we playtested some Unfair, 3-4 years ago, and some of the expansions online. With Fluttering Souls, the design is in Perth, obviously the most remote location in the world. And when we picked that game up, we're like, is it balanced? And he's like, yes, it's balanced. And I said, let's play 100 games and find out. And we played 100 games, and then we needed to play 1,200 games in total before it was balanced. And I did all of that on Tabletop Simulator and Tabletopia with him in Perth. Not possible, even with a designer in Sydney. I couldn't have played that many times. But we're able to sort of get on late at night and develop those games. And then we've done the same sort of thing with Guildmaster. That was developed mostly on Tabletopia. Both platforms have pros and cons, which is really interesting. Tabletopia has a kind of zero barrier to entry because free to play, you don't need to buy the platform, access to the platform at all, although you can buy it to get access to some of the games that do charge or need a premium player to participate. Tabletop Simulator is a low barrier to entry, about 30 Aussie dollars. Is that right? Everyone?
Something like that.
Yeah, sometimes 15 when it's on special, which is fantastic. And it's the advantage of Tabletop Simulator is it's got, unfortunately, a couple of things. You get spattered with blood as soon as you enter, and then you get punched in the jaw with the worst music in the world just after you've recovered from the blood splatter. So Tabletopia does a great job of just kind of onboarding people through a very slick professional process. Tabletop Simulator, a little bit rougher in that area, but it has scripting opened up to game designers and people who create the mods on those. So what we've been focusing on is trying to make the landing into those platforms as soft as possible with clever scripting. So, for example, if a deck needs to be shuffled, we'll have a button that just shuffles the deck. Or if you need to lay cards out into a market, we'll have a button that does that so that you don't have to manually reach for each game and each card and flip it over and then press the F key to flip them. They'll just all go and flip out and do that kind of stuff. So we actually employed some of the modders to help us do that with our upcoming game Funfair to make a really, really, really smooth mod that handles all the tedious stuff for you so that when you're playtesting, you can just play the game and not the mod itself. You know what I mean? You're seeing through the mod into just the game.
Is this just on a playtesting front, or are you actually looking to sell digital copies through something like Tabletop Simulator?
Well, this is playtesting initially, but to get good play, this is another issue that Alex and I will probably talk about as well, is you can't playtest and develop games like you used to. You can't do physical playtesting of games outside of a very small handful of people now. So what we've been trying to do is get the closest experience to a real tabletop experience in a development environment so that when playtesters come in, they're not giving us feedback about how this and that about the mod sucks. And that's not infecting our playtest data that we get. So we're putting that extra work up front into making the gameplay experience as smooth and as real as possible to reflect the actual physical game as far as humanly possible so that we get clean data on what people are enjoying or not enjoying in the game. Then from that, because we're putting so much polish into the development side of things, we're now using that in online conventions, very polished mods. We get a lot of really good feedback on having done that work. So it creates a great impression of the game up front because people are like, wow, I see the game, I don't see the mod. The mod's just doing this stuff for me, but not overdoing it.
especially with a lot of those conventions where you will be competing against a digital product, which does that
That's right.
part and parcel.
That's right.
Yes.
I think Ella was going to say something.
Yeah, I was just always curious. Well, is that expensive to do? Would that be a barrier for smaller publishers, given that they have to pay somebody to script it versus
Yeah,
a
I
bigger
mean, look,
publisher?
I think you're probably looking at sort of $30 an hour US for
Mm.
a coder to do a lot of the scripting. There are plenty of scripters who, if you have a cozy relationship with them, you might get something done for free. We went to modders who had already modded, for example, a fantastic version of Unfair on Tabletop Simulator and said, hey, with a few changes, could you do that in our upcoming game Funfair? And then we can also do some of the development in-house. So our graphic designer is a capable coder, unlike myself, and he can do a lot of that with simpler things. But where there was an existing community member who'd done fantastic work, we actually wanted to reward that community member for having done the mod, which is reverse thinking from what a lot of publishers are like. They're like, you stole our game, you made a free version of it.
That's
like, no,
the reaction. Yeah, some
that's right.
publishers
Well,
have.
our reaction is like, you made our game accessible online to thousands of people. Thank you. We're going to pay you to help do things for us in the future as well. So we're trying to actually engage with that community and not have this kind of barrier between them, because we think for the next year, it's going to be the main way people are playing serious tabletop games is through one of the online platforms. And beyond that, once COVID is done, the barrier to entry that previously existed for getting into online gaming has basically been blown away. And the number of people who try before they buy is going to be much larger after COVID. And they're going to try before they buy on...
Or expect an online version before they buy. Yeah,
that's right. And they want to play test it first, and they'll be comfortable, because you only need play 3 or 4 or 5 games in any of the platforms, and then you're over the fiddly control barrier. That is the real reason that most people didn't get into playing online, as well as communication issues. You typically start to find it a bit more difficult with 6+ players online, just with voice still at the same time.
Yeah.
So a lot of interesting things happening. I don't know, Alex, have you sort of had any experience with the platforms and modding? And
yeah, definitely. I've been programming a lot of well, when I say programming, I mean putting all the pretty pictures into Tabletop Simulator. The programming part is beyond me. Definitely not my language. But as Ella said, it is a limitation on smaller publishers. But again, almost everything just depends what you want to pay for. Because you can pay for good design, you can pay for good product, or you can pay for good artwork. Paying for good coding, it's all marketing, everything. You got to pay for everything. So it depends what you want to invest in. I don't think, like Kim's brought up a very good point, is that he's trying to make it very easily accessible for people that come in. But I guess when you're testing, you're usually, well, in my case, usually testing with other game designers before going public, and game designers don't mind it being fiddly. And if you have one person that can use the programs effectively, you don't have any problems. We play tested a game last night by a local Australian designer, and he just ran everything. Like, he clicked all the buttons. All you had to do was pick a card, and he would do the rest of it. And there was no hassle there. And I mean, we were all pretty adept in Tabletop Simulator, but just having him do it all made it super easy as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The other thing that people want... Oh, sorry. The other thing that people want to have, as well as try before you buy, is actually watch other people play. And that's been another great part of what's happened this year, which has been a huge explosion, particularly in the tabletop RPG space. It's called actual play, where you watch people play a tabletop RPG online. And Luke, you could actually speak to that, because
I do a little bit of that. I've got
your forte.
D&D podcast, and we actually did some work with Chaosium for a Call of Cthulhu miniseries. But yeah, it's been really good, because that is essentially what we go for. Like, the tone we try to strike is an example of a really polished home game. The kind of thing that you could do with friends at home is what we try to do when we produce I Speak Giant, the D&D show. And I think, again, that's always something that's transliterated pretty easily to existing media forms. You can stream that, or you can record the audio for that, and people can listen and consume. I think, as we're talking about the digitization of board games generally, and especially where content creation factors in, is it easier to show people playing board games if you get that digital capture. Because I know previously it's like you get a big camera top down on the table and it's like kind of far out. You can't really zoom in on components or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I choose what I play because not everything that you play is good to watch. Like you're enjoying, but it'll be like just dead air because you're thinking. So Euro games that are pretty long, not really that entertaining unless you have hobby gamers who are like in it to watch because they want to know how the mechanics work. But if it's just mainstream audience, they tune off. But basically, the statistic shows that people tune in 2 minutes in, and if they're not interested, they're gone. So you have to catch them quickly at the start. So I've been playing a lot of two-player games, which are pretty easy. A lot of trick-taking games, which are fun to watch because you're interacting. So if it's mostly it's games that have a lot of interaction that works for tabletop, because otherwise you're just watching people staring at a board. So that's been pretty hard.
Right. So you can't hear the cogs ticking in their
No,
head.
unless you have
can almost
content
hear it around the table.
creators. Yeah, unless you have content creators who are really good. They're really good people who can like talk about what they're doing, be animated, and that's a skill in itself. So not a gamer doesn't necessarily mean they'll be good in entertaining. So that's two things that you have to think about.
Yeah.
Everybody is a Twitch streamer now though, because everybody has a camera and it's pretty low, which is great, like a lower barrier to entry. So we do have like a diverse array of content. Like you see more women doing it, you see people of color doing it, and because everything is on equal footing in a way, just because in that sense, not that I'm saying everything is equal, but it's it's easier in that sense.
Yeah. And I think both on the tabletop actual play front and the board game front, it's absolutely crucial to understand that creating a product for entertainment is very different to shooting people playing a board game. I remember the Tabletop Effect, Will Wheaton's show, and what
so
that
good.
did for board game sales. But if you actually look at that show and have played those games, the edits are so tight on the actual gameplay, where they'll capture a handful of key moments from the game rather than the minute-to-minute gameplay.
Yes.
Yeah. That's true.
You need a production company to do that.
Another weird aspect of the online gaming platforms and real life is when you play games at a real table, there's a lot of usability aspects to it. You're physically sitting at a table like we all are now, and the game is within arm's reach of you, and the central game zone you could reach out and touch with your fingers if you just without even leaning over. So there's a fundamental distance usability aspect of every board game that's ever made. And that's why table filling games that are so big and have lots of tiny details, that can be a little bit stressful for gamers who haven't sort of eased into that because they're suffering from some sort of usability issues. That's all amplified online.
Yeah.
So it's a thing that will probably have some impact on the types of games that we're designing. And it may be a very subtle one, but it'll be one. It's harder to digest a big game on an online platform than it is on a real table. So in the way we've been doing our mods, we've been trying to sort of tighten the spaces up, keep it really tight so that you can zoom out and see the whole table, but still see the details you need. Yeah. And that's a key thing you've got to do.
Completely true for games that I'm familiar with in a physical copy. I've tried to load digital versions and been completely unable to even start, just because of the way the components have been set up is different to the way I do it at home, or like I can't find how to make certain moves that I know I could normally make. It's really interesting relearning to play those games almost.
Yeah. There's another thing that we've done recently, a couple of instances of it. We've had to do a few pitches to, for example, Barnes & Noble in the States, big retail chain, for some of our games. And their recommendation was to get a felt board and lay your game out and get a camera above it. And when I'm looking at that, I use the best quality camera I had access to because all the cameras dried up under COVID like that. I had the best quality sort of podcasting camera I could get my hands on, and it still wasn't good enough to make a good pitch. It simply wasn't good enough. So I said, guys, I'm going to change you to our tabletop simulator mod, and I'm going to show you the games there, and I'm going to then get you to play the game in 3 minutes. And so I took them through a game of Fluttering Souls and a round of Funfair, another upcoming game, using tabletop simulator to make that pitch. And the difference in the reaction I got when they were looking at the felt on a board version to when they were playing it on Tabletopia, on Tabletop Simulator, was just totally different. So I was able to zoom right into the cards and show them all the detailed artwork and the words on it, which I couldn't do with a camera mounted over a board. You just can't get that kind of zoom in, zoom out aspect. Last week, last week I had to do a panel, and I had retailers. It was for a US distribution company, Alliance, and it was pitching to retailers that go to Alliance. So it was kind of like an open house mini gamma type thing, trade show. And I had retailers turning up who had never played or heard of Tabletop Simulator. I was able to stream it through Discord in a 2-player game and say, okay, you guys are playing each other. You just tell me what to do. I'll move it for you, and I'll show you how this game works. And they were like, oh, we'll choose the red butterfly. I'll choose the blue butterfly. Pick. And they played the whole game out, and I was able to demo the game experience for them as if I was actually at a convention managing the game for them. And that was another really, really useful aspect that you can have when the mod's set up really nicely and works well.
We just ran the digital showcase for 2GDA. So usually every year just before PAX, we have a convention called DevCon where all the board game designers around Australia do get the opportunity to meet and greet. And you got a visitor there. And,
say hello. What are you looking for? You got to go.
So we did a digital showcase where we had all the Australian designers were able to show their games, and most of them used a digital format such as Tabletop Simulator, and they were able, as Kim said, to just jump on, share their screen, magnify things, and show us how the game works in under 10 minutes. And that was really good experience too.
One of the challenges we have, of course, is being in Australia, trying to take things internationally and globally is time zones.
Yep.
And we actually have our digital content team based in Melbourne, Australia, and we run various streams of our games and things. And what we've of course done is, rather than do them live, we actually do them as pre-records, because it would be very unfair for them to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning to reach our key audiences in the United States or elsewhere. And I've actually become, over this whole COVID period, basically nocturnal, because I deal a lot with my colleagues overseas. Yesterday I had a meeting, a management meeting, I guess you could say, of our company, and it started at 11 p.m. for me. And the exciting news for that was when daylight savings, or whatever the clocks change in the US in a couple of weeks' time, my meeting is going to start at midnight. So we do have a saying in our company that the sun never rises on Chaosium, because we have people all over the world. And that's definitely going to be the case for me. But I like living in Australia, so...
Agreed.
There is actually an issue with online conventions. So, for example, PAX being in the Australian time zone was really good, running the collaboratory sessions on PAX, but I think that it was hard to get engagement with US participants or European participants, because most of the collaborative
everyone's accustomed to their time zone.
Yeah, and people have, if they're not going to take a week off to do an online PAX or online convention, they're limited their night times, and nighttime windows don't overlap very neatly. We found at Gen Con, we just had to try and schedule things all over the place, and I was a wreck after that. It was like having jet lag. It was like the whole Gen Con experience, like a big overseas convention where you go, you're jet lagged, you're on for like 20 hours a day, you sleep for 4 hours, and then you're back on again. It felt like that, but a virtual version of it, because you're just scheduling events to run at all sorts of different times.
I think that's actually an excellent segue, just moving into talking more generally about the landscape. And we can start with what the event scene has looked like. Because I know, obviously, personally, when it comes to discovery and demo and making impressions with a mass audience, events are actually a really good way to do that. But that's been fairly difficult to manage this year, either for time zone reasons or because we haven't had kind of that physical passerby effect. So I think on your end, well, we'll start with Michael, because I know you had Chaosium Con planned for the first half of the year, and I think that was one of the first victims on the proverbial chopping block.
Yeah, we were going to have Chaosium Con Down Under in Sydney back in early May, and I would say at some point in March, I had said to my colleagues, this is going to be cancelled. I can't see that this is going to go on. And sadly, we did have to cancel it. And I think we made the right decision. What we did, and I'm sure every other convention in the world's had to make this decision, we were at a crunch point where, if we go ahead at this point, we're about to start spending serious money on stuff that's going to be a real pain to try and get that money back if we cancel. So we had to make that decision. So
all too well.
Instead, yeah, indeed. So we took part in one of the first online conventions that had sort of started up after we'd cancelled Chaosium Con, which is called Nexuscon, which is normally a face-to-face small convention up at Coffs Harbour, and that was a great learning experience for us about how to do things online. And that was great because then later on in the year we had Gen Con online, which was very big, and we ended up recruiting about 60 GMs to run our games at Gen Con online. So that took an enormous amount of coordination. We had our various convention coordinators up and awake across the 24 hours a day while that ran. And that was very successful. And then later in the year, of course, we did the same thing at PAX Online as well. And it generally went very well. I'm sure everyone had their technical problems at times, but by and large, we got really, really good feedback from all the players that participated, and the GMs enjoyed themselves too.
Can I ask, Michael, running 24/7 like that, how did you find that worked in terms of engaging a global audience via Gen Con?
It worked really well for us because we have people in the UK and we have people in the US that were also on board to run it. If we were trying to run this just from Australia, I can tell you it would kill us, because how can you stay awake all of that time? So we had GMs that were not just in the US, they were in Australia, we had some in Europe, we had some in South America. And that is the great thing about doing things online like this. You can bring people in from everywhere. The other thing we started to do this year we've never done before is we actually offered game sessions in other languages as well. So we were running games in Spanish and Portuguese.
Fantastic. What's Cthulhu in Spanish?
I think it's actually Cthulhu. I think it's spelled the same way.
Oh my God. The Googling.
It's its own language, right? So.
Yeah, it's its own language.
Cthulhu or...
Yeah.
So while we're talking about the landscape, I think something I wanted to touch on, because I don't know if an avid hobbyist here would likely know, when we're looking at the Australian tabletop space, who would be the major players? Who do you want to keep an eye on to make sure you're informed, make sure you're up to date with local releases? How does someone who is watching this know who to go and follow after this to stay informed and to be a part of the wider community?
Me, what I look at is a lot of...
Oh, I thought that was just the answer.
No, I'm not
me.
saying me. No. That's not what I meant. I was going to say, I look at a lot of Facebook groups, because there's a lot of engagement in Facebook groups and Twitter. Like social media, do not... I'm going to say this in a positive way. Publishers there should be no small influencer, because even small streamers are important. Why? Because not a lot of publishers have the capability to stream, do online games, do demos themselves. So content creators have built-in tech to do it. So if you reach out to the right content creator who can show your game well, like it's a good fit, you can actually reach a great audience, because everything is niche, like because it's online, everything is just small parts of the internet. So if you reach that small space really well, it's a better conversion rather than reaching out to a big channel and the audience is segmented. So I'm just Yeah, so that's my experience. So reaching out to a lot of people with small niche audiences has been really great for me as a distributor. Looking at that, I don't. But the biggest ones that I know of are, in terms of content creation, are Stella of Meeple University. She also does the Dice Tower. There's the Dice Men. There's a
The
lot
Dice
of
Men.
the Dice Men are pretty good. There's also oh, I'm gonna get in trouble for this. But Ashley Board Gamer Girl also from Instagram, and there's Board Game Barbecue. They're new, really good
Yeah.
podcasts, and a lot of streamers also on. There's a big one that I will remember later on when I have another banana, maybe.
He's running low.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, a lot of because of the change in the landscape, it's actually easier for Aussies to reach out to international audience also in that sense, because now we don't have to go to conventions. Before, I had to pay my own money, go to conventions, and reach out to publishers in order for them to even talk to me. Because it's a very what you don't know about some people don't know, it's a very personal industry. Like, they have to know you in order to work with you, like know you personally. From my experience, like, you have to network personally. And if they're comfortable with you and you build a rapport, that's when you get to be able to do the content that you want, in that sense, and get access to the games that you want. So that's pretty important. So that's changed because we don't have to travel anymore.
Yeah,
It certainly has leveled
absolutely.
the playing field.
Just on, I think the other three of you can speak to this. I personally really like to follow writers and designers. Are there any big names in the local industry or that you've worked with that we should be keeping an eye on?
I stay in contact with the Campaigner magazine as well. They do a weekly thing about what's happening in tabletop, as well as the Dice Men. I doubly recommend the Dice Men.
Yes.
Yeah, the nice thing about the Dice Men is they've shifted to a sort of an interview format with people in the Australian scene. So it's a mix of designers and publishers and artists and that kind of stuff. So you'll get a nice in-depth take on somebody's role in the industry, nice sort of hour-long interview. They also try and stay very much on top of every Australian board game release and definitely cover those. Board Gamer Girl on Instagram, I think, is pretty similar. She's covered a bunch of our stuff in the past, and she's got a very, very large following.
One of the biggest.
Yeah, great
Aussie.
Reach. Beautiful photos up there. She always looks so happy to be playing the game. So,
which is important.
It's definitely helpful. It is, yeah. And
well, if she looks really angry playing the games, I don't know if you'd buy them.
That's right. Ellie, you kind of touched on this before, and that is the diversification of people who are talking about games and playing games and being seen to be playing games. I think that's been responsible for such a large chunk of the growth in board gaming over the last 10 years, is that diversity and inclusiveness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Finding the right content creators that have those wider audiences or different audiences, perhaps, is a key strategy as well.
Yeah, just speaking as a woman.
We're very lucky.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. You can go.
We're very lucky that here in Australia we have a very, very solid community of people that have written for Chaosium Games going all the way back to straight after Call of Cthulhu was published, and quite a few of those people are in Melbourne. That is, in fact, one of the reasons why we were going to do Chaosium Con Down Under, to help celebrate so many of those writers. And I think of there are two classic Call of Cthulhu releases that came out. One was a long time ago. It was called Horror on the Orient Express.
I played that.
And that were many of the writers of that were in fact people based here in Australia, which is a wonderful thing. And then last year we brought out a book called Terra Australis, which was a reprint of something, the second edition of a book that came out originally in 1987. And we had a launch event for that in a pub here, which is the sort of thing we can't do anymore, and bought a lot of those brought a lot of those writers together. What was very exciting is we were then approached by the National Library of Australia, and they wanted to have a copy of Terra Australis in their collection, as they considered it to be a book of national cultural significance. Which
That's
very exciting.
amazing. Awesome.
I appreciate we are chewing through time here, and I do really want to go back to this because it's something that I think a few people flagged earlier, is talking about specifically the design scene in Australia and how that's changing. But what I did want to look at, just so it wasn't complete freeform, do jump in if you have thoughts though, is the idea of how the funding process works and what regular people can do to help support designers, what designers can do to better engage that. Again, just how that symbiotic relationship works and how the next steps happen there, how that grows into a more robust industry, analogous to, I guess, the Australian digital indie industry, which has had, a lot of government support, a lot of great strides in recent years.
I think when the landscape changes back to a bit more normalcy, and people can go to all the little local conventions, I think that's a great thing for the public to do, because a lot of these local conventions do support indie game designers, and there'll be a couple of small bunch of people that will have their prototype games there. And I think the public really has to not be afraid of playing a game that might just look like paper, or might have shoddy graphics or shoddy artwork. Like, really try and focus on the gameplay and give these small publishers a chance.
I think there's a few things happening at a few levels. Number one, PAX Australia has the fantastic collaboratory environment, and I think that's kind of embedded at the very highest level, because PAX Melbourne is the biggest Australian tabletop gaming convention. I mean, you've got, I think, Luke, you could probably tell me, but it's somewhere between 12 and 1,500 seats for open tabletop play, something like that.
Something like that. It changes year on year.
But it changes year on year.
It's 6 bays of the MCEC. It's not small.
It's huge. Yeah, it's huge. So it's by far the largest convention, and to have a formal space for board game designers to show off their prototypes to other designers and the sort of game public, more interested gaming public, I think that's enshrined in other conventions, which has always been the case, as you said, Alex. But I think now it's kind of set the benchmark and said, look, having game designers show off their games and seek playtesting feedback at a public gaming space is now just normal and should be welcomed. I've been seeing this for many years, and there is sometimes from some gamers like a bit of an attitude about why would I playtest a game? I'm just here to have fun. I think that response is reducing year by year as we get more and more games coming out from Australia, and people seeing that the playtesting they might have done 2 years ago results in a game coming out that had their input in it a few years later, and then just going, that's so cool, I got to help make a game better. People getting to see themselves in that process is really maturing. And I think that's part of how the Australian game design scene is maturing as well, because I think game designers are starting to get better at understanding how to pitch their game, how to shape the game experience in those playtests, and then how to give the playtester a better experience so that they're more likely to come back a second time. It's how to be more considerate of the things that playtesters need and want to get their jollies out of it.
I suppose like a whole soft skill set that's about getting a game made that isn't just designing the mechanics of a game.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. I found that the games that do well, you build a community around the game more than the idea of the usual marketing. Like if you look at successful ones, the community participates in the making of the game. Like if they have a card that they want to come out, or on BGG they talk about like how they can improve the game. Even if you don't take all of the input, the idea that they can be, contributing to something that is they're part of, I find that is very effective. I don't know. Is that what you found?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think there's another interesting thing that's just evidence of the fact we're having this conversation today. Melbourne International Games Week has definitely brought in board games and tabletop RPGs as another pillar of what they do. And I guess you could say that video games is, a big part of it. But now they've recognized and understood that board games and tabletop RPGs are another important art form to support as well. So I'm hoping that Creative Victoria, in particular, is going to continue that support. There's a new minister, so I did give a copy of the old minister a copy of Terra Australis. I'm going to have to get a copy of Terra Australis to the new minister as well.
But I do think that is a good point when you're looking at the maturity of an industry. Is how nicely does it play with government, for one, but how seriously does it take itself? Like, is it critical enough of itself to evolve and develop? And it's kind of reductive to say to do the hard yards to progress. But if you look at what's happened to digital game design in Australia, it's absolutely gone through that transformation. You've had studios pop up, seek government funding, form proper companies, and actually like open themselves up to scrutiny and transformation.
It is a slightly different landscape with digital games compared to board games, though, because when you help fund a digital game, all the money is going into an Australian business that's creating jobs for Australians, and all the money is staying in Australia. It's different when you try and fund a board game, because you might be paying a designer, but the production might be done overseas. The artwork might be done overseas. The graphic design might be done overseas. So the money isn't staying within Australia. Even selling the units, like you make a big amount of production, and then you might give some to America, but it's at a heavily reduced price because they're going to distribute it in America. You give some to Europe, again, heavily distributed, reduced price. And within Australia, there's not as many big distribution channels as there would be overseas.
I think that's a really good point. Is there... I mean, I don't think we're going to have a solution to that here, but I think that's really important to keep in mind. How does that...
Make a solution, Luke.
Make a solution. No currency like Star Trek. We just trade board games.
Oh.
Look, Australian board game sales have been growing for 20 years, pretty much like it's a direct curve. And the fact that you can find games in places like Zing, the EB Games, other brand, and then you can find them in bookstores and other interesting places. Now you're seeing a lot more games in places like newsagents that have diversified from selling news to selling gifts. There's a lot more points of sales in Australia now. You might find them in cigarette shops or tobacco shops or whatever, as horrible as that might be, to also just gift stores in major shopping centres. And we've, the Good Games retail brand has experimented with a few shopping centre stores in the big sort of Westfield major shopping centres, and they have been doing phenomenally well. So there's an appetite for games in Australia that I think we still haven't seen the end of that curve. Like, it's just going up and up and up. And in the times like COVID, where you kind of tap out on digital consumption, playing actual games together, real physical games, is really, really attractive if you can find the people to play it with, or you happen to live in a place you can game safely in, or have a few friends you can game safely in. So I think game sales in Australia, whilst they may only be 3 or 4% of global game sales, there's still a lot of room for growth in Australia. We don't have a lot of like serious board games in places like Target or Kmart or whatever yet, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility.
We do now. We actually have good board games in Target and Kmart now. So
fantastic.
We're slowly getting there.
We opened our own fulfillment warehouse here in Australia for Chaosium. This is before COVID, because we actually thought the market here was big enough for us to do that, to have it ourselves. Otherwise, we would have to bring it in from overseas, and it'd be a lot more expensive. So we now actually have warehouses in the US, the UK, Poland, Canada, and Australia, and we fulfill from each of those because we see them as audiences that can grow. And I'm very excited, because I live in Australia, that we actually have that set up here too.
I think to go back to what Alex was saying, it is interesting looking at both scale and scope, because I think those are the two chief concerns when you look at how much it costs to actually produce a board game. And something that Kim was saying earlier and Alex was saying earlier about the popularity of smaller scale kind of 2-player card games, really serving that kind of gateway niche, because obviously not everyone can afford to have their own fulfillment center in Australia. Not everyone can afford to produce a 150 mini Eric Lang Kickstarter smash hit. but maybe it is a start small thing and support those local games so it can grow from those acorns. Because we could start putting out those, you know, CMON huge shelf breakers that have that level of production, but that's just not where we're at yet.
Yeah, well, I think that's historically proven. So, I put in a lot of work years back when I was publishing our first game, Monstrous, which is a small box game that I sort of developed a method to ship that globally from China, based on other Chinese shipping services. One's called Send from China. There's another one called China Fulfill. So if you're an Australian designer looking to make a small game, you can quite feasibly make the game in China, send it to a Chinese fulfillment company. As long as it's under about 700 grams, it's viable to then send that game to every backer in the world directly from China. Means you don't need to worry about ships, customs, all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of stuff around European VAT that you have to sort of come under the VAT collection barrier there, which is all changing now. I've got to look at all of that, but it's quite viable. So we did that. We got like 1,500 backers for our first Kickstarter. I don't know if Alex, you've ever used them, but
we use GamesQuest, I think.
Okay. Yeah, GamesQuest are a UK-based one. So there's a number of different fulfillment options now that, excuse me, allow Australian game designers to get their games out to a global audience. And look, that's on the back of Kickstarter. Let's be honest. The sort of surge in the popularity of Australian designed games is on the back of Kickstarter. So many Australian games have been published that wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, if not for crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter and others.
Just about to say, crowdfunding absolutely feels like a game changer for tabletop design. I mean, it's a glorified pre-order system, but like it's nice to know that it exists in a way where you can make sure a game is essentially viable before you go through the cost of publishing it and producing it.
Yeah.
I was very happy also to see like mainstream media covering like Australian designers. I know Kimi were on the Age, and who else was Phil Walker Harding was also there. So I was like trying to summon all my mental energy.
I was on 3RRR as well.
Yeah.
International Games Week.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that like mainstream media will have more local designers and local publishers on. Like if you have a way for them to get in touch with all these designers, that would be great. Like I think it's great for the industry. There's more mainstream coverage. Even in Kotaku, which is mainly a video game, there have been articles about board games. So I hope that continues.
Yeah. I think what's likely there is that the mainstream media forms the widest end of the marketing funnel, right? And I don't necessarily mind. I think it's fantastic that they covered Phil. I know, in sort of board game chat circles, there are a few people a bit critical that, again, the games are talking about Catan and Monopoly and that sort of stuff. Yeah. I'm kind of okay with that because if it talks about something they're familiar with and then brings them a little bit deeper somehow, and that's good. It's all part of the funnel. Just as long as it gets them coming to a game store to explore the games that might appeal to them. No journalist can ever sort of cherry pick the right games that's going to appeal to every single audience member. So as long as they're talking about, like Matt Leacock in Pandemic, about how that's been such a phenomenally popular game.
Successful.
And exactly. If that lets people understand that there's games beyond the ones they may have heard of, then they'll explore and find the rest. I'm fine with that funnel, just pulling people into the game system that we have here. So
get them to the store is the first thing that you want. Yeah,
and I think that absolutely holds true because once people take those first steps in, and if it's something they like, they're going to explore. Like that's absolutely key to growing an audience base. Yeah.
0 to now. Yeah. I never played a board game. Well, I did, like Monopoly. I didn't count that.
So you're kind of like 3 years in, right, Ella? Is that about right?
Yeah, 3 years in. So I knew nothing about modern board games until I figured it out. Like
now you know everything.
Yeah. I went all in.
Right into the deep end, it feels.
It really did.
So I think that kind of brings us very neatly to one of the final things we'll be talking about here. What does the future look like? How does the industry grow? What do people have to look forward to coming out of Australian tabletop?
It's a big question in these times, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think there'll be some adaptation. I suspect we're going to see Kickstarter numbers, I think, are down in terms of backing numbers because the type of people that are on Kickstarter are frankly the most committed board gamers on the planet, and that's the audience there. A lot of those guys and girls have games stacked up that they haven't been able to get to play. So I think there's going to be a bit of a lag and a slowdown on Kickstarter. There are new rival platforms for Kickstarter starting up that might fracture their base a little bit further. So that might that's GameFound. I think they've launched a new one. I think it's maybe free to use. Maybe there's just a Stripe fee or something. So we'll see how that goes. But we're going to continue to try and bring out 4 releases at least a year. There will be some of those will be couples and family friendly, and some of them will be, more hardcore gamer type games. And we're going to try and find the right balance there. So you could sort of, from our point of view, look forward to at least 4 games a year. This year, it looks like we might have a 5th. We'll have Funfair out in Australia just before Christmas. We're going to try and keep that pace up, but it's a very hard pace to keep up for a small company, right, Alex?
Yeah, we're only looking at 2, so you doing 5 is huge.
Yeah. So I think you can start to expect that to happen, but I think it's really mainly Good Games Publishing, Red Genie Games, and probably Grail Games are the 3 Australian publishers that are bringing out multiple games that aren't self-published per year. So I don't know whether there'll be another player. Rule and Make was around a couple of years ago, but they have sadly folded last year, I think, sometime.
Yeah.
But there are a few other small Australian publishers that might branch out into publishing other games. I know Craven Games is looking at doing that and that sort of thing. So hopefully we'll see some more growth and get more Australian publishers to take a lot of the games. Because if you go to Collaboratory, there's dozens of games to choose from. They're all fantastic. It's just the depth that we've got here in the Australian design pool is really good. We just don't have perhaps enough publishers to bring all those to market. So there's going to be a lot more self-publishing, I think, for the foreseeable future, as long as sort of Kickstarter remains robust. But it's going to be a bit of a tighter fight on Kickstarter for the next couple of years as people kind of recover from that lag.
Yeah, we are going to be continuing to massively grow our actual play offerings and opportunities for people to be able to play, experience, and watch our games online, because we see that as a huge growth area for bringing in new players, both players that have played other tabletop RPGs and board games to get interested in ours, but also just reaching a wider audience of people that have never played anything before. We're very much pushing hard the idea of show rather than tell, and we think that's going to be a very powerful thing. And as I said, our digital content team is here in Australia, so we'll be having a lot of Australian people involved.
I think that's a very smart strategy, Michael.
Yeah. In relation to that, in terms of media and community, I think, well, unfortunately, online conventions are going to be a thing. Even the Melbourne Toy Fair is going to be digital next year. They've already announced. So I see it growing in that sense. I know there are a lot of community game groups, like our Ring, a local one, which is a big one. I think there are 5 game groups in that one, like Ringwood Social Games. They're all doing digital games right now. So if you want to hop on, just go to Facebook groups and you can actually find somebody to play with. Yeah, and that's it. Yeah.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm excited for the future. I need more games in my life.
Me too.
And
aside from the 300 I have, yeah.
Well, the pile never gets smaller. I think it's really encouraging that it feels like the industry has adapted and responded to really difficult times really intelligently and smartly. And it feels like there's a lot of opportunity for growth, especially moving into future years. It's just stepping up and seizing it, and I'm really excited to see that happen.
Us too.
It's good. I think just before we close out and say goodbye, I always like to do this at the end of anything I moderate. Please shamelessly plug yourselves and where people can find your work.
Yes.
We can go in the same order again. Kim, if you want to kick off.
So you can go to goodgamespublishing.com. There's no AU on the internet. Goodgamespublishing.com to see all the games that we have and the ones that are coming up. And you can find us at Good Games Publishing on all the socials as well.
Ella?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I'm Ella Loves Board Games everywhere except Twitter, which is Ella Loves PG because Twitter likes it short. I'm also streaming. I'm also streaming on Twitch now. So if you want to see like game stream live, then you can go to Ella Loves Board Games on Twitch. I'm also on the Dice Tower, Aussie representing. Yeah.
Fantastic. Alex?
RedGenieGames.com is where you can see games we've released and buy the Damsel's Tale, which is a fantastic two-player game. We're also Red Genie Games on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the works. And if you want to get involved in the board game design scene, visit TGDAUS on Facebook, which is a big online group. We also have tgda.org.au if you want to see what that's all about and get into designing your own board game.
Fantastic. And Michael?
Cool. Chaosium.com, and we're also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and everywhere else. Chaosium.com.
Thank you very much.
You're famous.
And finally, I'm Luke. Please come to PAX. It's a lot of fun. Check out I Speak Giant if you want some actual play tabletop. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you for hanging out.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you.